The Chicago rain hammered heavy drops against my office window in the loop when Sarah walked in. She didn't need to say a word for me to know she was in trouble. Her expensive coat was soaked through, and the way she lit her cigarette betrayed hands trembling from suspicion and a lack of sleep. She sat across from me and began to pour it all out. She explained that Michael, her husband, wasn't really there anymore. She described how their luxurious home in Lincoln Park had become cold and alienated, a place where they shared the same bed but lived on separate continents. Sarah told me about the nights she lies awake, listening for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway at 2 a.m. She described the moments he enters the bedroom and tries to shower quietly, but the smell always preceded him. It wasn't the scent of cheap perfume or alcohol, which would have made my job easy and predictable. She spoke of a sharp, almost suffocating smell of disinfectants, Lysol, and industrial soap. In her mind, this smell had become a monster. She imagined Michael renting rooms in seedy motels on the South Side, places so filthy he felt the need to scrub himself before returning to her. But the most painful part was her description of the touch that had vanished. She told me that Michael simply stopped touching her. There was no active rejection or loud arguments, but something much worse: total physical silence. She described how every time she tried to place a hand on his shoulder or even just get close to him in the hallway, he would dodge her gently, moving aside as if he were made of glass that might break. He didn't hug her when he returned, didn't kiss her goodbye, and when they lay in bed at night, he would cling to the farthest edge, his back to her, stiff as a statue. To her, this lack of touch was the ultimate proof that he belonged to someone else. She also told me about his phone, which had become a secret organ of his body. He always placed it face down, and every time a late-night message arrived, he would jump as if shot. She saw him deleting messages in a hurry, leaving a trail of suspicious silence. Michael was a vice president at a major investment bank, and the thought of him hanging around hideout apartments on the South Side with a secret mistress was driving her mad. Following Michael wasn't just another job. It became a test of endurance that required every trick I'd learned in 20 years on Chicago's gritty streets. But unlike other cases, the mission here wasn't to dodge a watchful eye. Michael didn't suspect he was being followed at all. He was so deeply buried in his own private hell that he walked through the world like a ghost. He would stare straight ahead with glassy eyes, moving through crowds without seeing anyone. To him, I and my gray Ford were just another part of the city's silent landscape. I parked my car on Wacker Drive, right under the massive shadow of the skyscraper where his bank was located. I sat there, surrounded by the smell of cold coffee and old upholstery, and waited. When he emerged at 6:15 p.m., Michael didn't look like the successful banker Sarah had described. He looked drained. He walked with heavy steps toward his car, never looking left or right, not even checking his rearview mirror as he merged into traffic. His lack of awareness was almost painful to watch. A man so distracted is easy prey for any investigator, but here it only testified to the weight of the burden he was carrying. For a full week, I was his shadow. He didn't head north to the fancy house in Lincoln Park but pulled south, toward neighborhoods where the streetlights are broken and the buildings look like they are about to collapse. He drove on autopilot, stopping at red lights long after they turned green, lost in thoughts that made him forget where he was. I kept a safe distance, not because I was afraid he'd spot me, but because I was afraid he might actually cause an accident due to his lack of focus. He always ended his exhausting journey at the same crumbling brick building on the south side, a structure that looked like a relic of a grand industrial past turned to ruin. Michael would get out of the car, sometimes leaving it unlocked, forgetting the outside world as he ran into the darkness of the stairwell. He would disappear inside for hours, and during that time, I would sit in the car, watching the dim light on the fourth floor flicker on. When he left the building around midnight, he looked as if he had aged 10 years every single day. There were no women, no smiles, only that sharp smell of medicine and bleach clinging to his coat. Buildings like that are a private investigator's nightmare. The silence that reigns within them is our greatest betrayer. This wasn't a skyscraper bustling with businessmen where you could blend into the elevator. It was a ghost structure where every movement was scrutinized. I had several concrete obstacles that prevented me from simply following Michael inside. First was the entry system. The building was equipped with a heavy wooden door with an old but stubborn locking mechanism that required a code or a physical key. There was no doorman to bribe and no stream of residents to tailgate. Any attempt to tamper with the lock while Michael was within earshot would have ended in total failure. Second, the acoustics of the structure were lethal. We're talking about a building with old oak floors that had dried and groaned for a century. Every step on the stairs leading to the fourth floor produced a creak that echoed through the entire space like a gunshot. In a building with no music, no TVs, and no hallway chatter, the silence is absolute. Even a man as distracted as Michael would jump at the sound of strange footsteps approaching him in a closed, empty space. Outside on the street, I was just another car. Inside, I was a tangible threat. Another obstacle was the problematic lighting. The hallways were lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows on the peeling walls. There were no real dark corners to hide in if Michael suddenly decided to leave the apartment or look back. In such a situation, you have no escape route. If he sees you in the narrow fourth-floor hallway, you have no logical excuse for being there. You are permanently burned. Finally, there were the eyes of the neighborhood. In these parts of South Chicago, a stranger in a suit or even in tactical gear sitting too long in a stairwell attracts the attention of the few residents below. I didn't want a neighbor calling the police or asking questions that would reach Michael's ears. I was stuck outside the walls of his secret, realizing Michael wasn't having an affair but was drowning in something far deeper. These physical barriers, the locked door, the creaking stairs, and the exposed hallways were what forced me to think outside the box. I had to wait for a trigger that would shake him enough to make him run in a panic, leaving all those barriers wide open behind him without even noticing. The bouquet of flowers wasn't just a gift. It was my key to that locked door. After 10 days of fruitless surveillance from the street, I realized that Michael was fortified within his secret and that no passive observation would break him. I needed to create a provocation, something that would shake his system and force him to make a major mistake. This was how the idea of the flower bouquet was born. I went for something that could not be ignored. A giant, menacing bouquet of black roses mixed with pure white lilies. It was a bouquet that signaled beauty on one hand and a mysterious danger on the other. I asked the shop to send it to their home in Lincoln Park at an hour when I knew they would both be home together for dinner. On the attached card, I wrote only one large letter in black ink, M. It was a precise psychological trap. I knew that for Sarah, this letter would symbolize Michael. But I knew that in Michael's eyes, as he was under immense pressure to keep his secret, this letter would be interpreted as a message from the past. A message from Marcus, his father. My goal was to make him believe that someone on the outside had discovered his hiding place and that he was now under threat. I wanted to see where he would run when he felt the walls closing in on him. I watched their house from a safe distance inside my car. Minutes after the courier left, the front door slammed open. Michael emerged clutching the bouquet, his face the color of ash. He was no longer driving with his signature caution. He tore through the streets of Chicago like a man pursued by the devil, racing through yellow lights and endangering both himself and those around him. This time, I didn't have to worry about being spotted. He was completely distracted. I followed him to a familiar brick building on the city's south side. He ran inside without even locking his car. I climbed after him up the rusty fire escape on the side of the building, clinging to the shadows, and managed to reach the fourth floor. I peered inside through a crack in the door he had left half open in his haste. It wasn't a love nest or a hideout for a mistress. The apartment had been makeshift into a private hospital room. There were oxygen tanks, medical monitoring devices, and stacks of expensive medications. In the bed lay a very old man, so withered and weak he was almost unrecognizable. It was Marcus, Michael's father, the notorious con artist who had vanished with investors' money 30 years ago, the man all of Chicago believed had died long ago in Germany, had returned to the city to die in the shadows. The sight revealed to me through that crack in the door, in that dimly lit fourth-floor hallway, was like nothing I had imagined during my 2 weeks of surveillance. Michael, who in his ordinary life looked like he had been pulled from a catalog of successful businessmen, stood there trembling. The door wasn't fully shut. In his panic, he had left a gap of a few centimeters, enough for me to witness the drama unfolding inside without him sensing my presence. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, but the sound and the smell. There was the rhythmic, faint beeping of a medical monitor, a cold, metallic sound that felt entirely foreign to this crumbling building. The air in the apartment was saturated with the heavy scent of disinfectants, ammonia, and oxygen vapors. It was the exact smell Sarah had detected on his coat every night. It wasn't the scent of betrayal, but the smell of a slow, controlled expiration. In the center of the room, on a medical bed brought there in secret, lay a man who looked like a mere shadow of a human being. His skin was as thin as parchment, stretched over prominent cheekbones, and transparent plastic tubes trailed from his nose to large oxygen tanks standing in the corner. This was Marcus, the brilliant con artist who had once defrauded half of Chicago's City Hall, now appeared completely helpless, withering away within the white sheets. I watched as Michael placed the bouquet, my black roses and white lilies, onto an old formica table cluttered with medicine bottles and used syringes. The contrast was jarring. The expensive, elegant flowers sitting next to makeshift medical equipment and the peeling walls of South Chicago. Michael didn't say a word. He simply collapsed into a folding plastic chair by the bed, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob. These were quiet, desperate sobs, the kind that come from a man who has reached the absolute limit of his endurance. Then I saw Marcus's hand, a trembling, weak hand, covered in dark age spots, rose slowly from the sheet and began to stroke Michael's hair. In that single gesture, the whole story was told. To Michael, Marcus wasn't the villain who had destroyed Sarah's family. He was simply his father. Inside this isolated apartment, Michael wasn't a bank vice president. He was a little boy trying to save the fragments of his father from a world that wanted to swallow him whole. He began to whisper to the dying man, his voice breaking as he explained that he thought someone had found them, that the flowers with the letter M were a sign that their location had been discovered. He looked terrified by the thought that his secret would explode and destroy the life he had built with Sarah. He touched the flowers with a mix of awe and dread, as if trying to understand where they had come from, and in that moment, I realized the sheer cruelty of my trap. The bouquet I sent didn't return to Sarah as evidence of a romantic betrayal. Instead, it served as a testament to a painful human tragedy, of a man who simply wanted to say goodbye to his father without destroying his present life. In that moment, I knew my investigation was over. The truth I had uncovered was far more complex and devastating than anything Sarah could have ever imagined. The Chicago rain hammered heavy drops against my office window in the loop when Sarah walked in. She didn't need to say a word for me to know she was in trouble. Her expensive coat was soaked through, and the way she lit her cigarette betrayed hands trembling from suspicion and a lack of sleep. She sat across from me and began to pour it all out. She explained that Michael, her husband, wasn't really there anymore. She described how their luxurious home in Lincoln Park had become cold and alienated, a place where they shared the same bed but lived on separate continents. Sarah told me about the nights she lies awake, listening for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway at 2 a.m. She described the moments he enters the bedroom and tries to shower quietly, but the smell always preceded him. It wasn't the scent of cheap perfume or alcohol, which would have made my job easy and predictable. She spoke of a sharp, almost suffocating smell of disinfectants, Lysol, and industrial soap. In her mind, this smell had become a monster. She imagined Michael renting rooms in seedy motels on the South Side, places so filthy he felt the need to scrub himself before returning to her. She described how she would close her eyes and picture him in the arms of another woman amidst that chemical stench, wondering what could be so dark that it required such sterilization. But the most painful part was her description of the touch that had vanished. She told me that Michael simply stopped touching her. There was no active rejection or loud arguments, but something much worse: total physical silence. She described how every time she tried to place a hand on his shoulder or even just get close to him in the hallway, he would dodge her gently, moving aside as if he were made of glass that might break. She felt there was a transparent, frozen wall between them. He didn't hug her when he returned, didn't kiss her goodbye, and when they lay in bed at night, he would cling to the farthest edge, his back to her, stiff as a statue. To her, this lack of touch was the ultimate proof that he belonged to someone else, that he was saving his warmth for another place, and that she had become a stranger in her own home. She went on to tell me about his phone, which had become a secret organ of his body. She described how he always placed it face down, and how every time a late-night message arrived, he would jump as if shot. She saw him deleting messages in a hurry whenever she entered the kitchen, leaving a trail of suspicious silence behind. As far as she was concerned, the conclusion was clear. Michael was cheating on her, and he was doing it in parts of the city they never dreamed of stepping foot in. She didn't understand why a man of his stature, with his salary and his name, would seek thrills in places where addresses aren't listed on GPS and the neon is always flickering. Her fear wasn't just the physical betrayal, but the thought that he was hiding an entire world from her, dirty and dangerous, that she was not a part of. Michael was a vice president at a major investment bank, a well-known and respected figure in Chicago, and the thought of him hanging around hideout apartments on the South Side with a secret mistress was driving her mad. She felt the man she had known for a decade had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating, and mysterious version. I took the case, listening to her every word and realizing that Sarah's greatest fear wasn't that Michael had stopped loving her, but that he had stopped being the person she thought she knew. But from the very first night of surveillance, when I smelled the heavy air of South Chicago for myself, I realized this story wasn't behaving like a typical case of infidelity.